Monday morning, 2005. Grace Whitmore drove her silver Honda Civic down Highway 9 to pick up her textbooks. By nightfall, the car was still there. Keys inside, driver's seat empty. Inside the cabin, police found an unmade bed and a faint streak of blood across the sheet. Melbourne, Arkansas searched for days, their candles lighting the highway where she was last seen. 16 years later, a DNA match from Oregon exposed a truth no one was ready to face. What really happened that night? Where are you watching from? And does your hometown have its own cold case? Subscribe and ring the bell, because in stories like this, justice never sleeps. Late September in Melbourne, Arkansas, often arrived wrapped in gentle morning fog. Sunlight crept over pine-covered hills, touching the sleepy town with golden streaks. Here, neighbors knew each other's birthdays, left their doors unlocked, and trusted the quiet rhythm of country life. No one expected the day to break that trust. On Monday, Grace Whitmore woke before dawn, her mind already ticking through a checklist of tasks. At 22, she balanced college classes, volunteer shifts, and a complicated love life. Today, she'd drive out to Ethan's cabin, a weathered place on the edge of town, tucked behind a line of cedar trees. She needed to pick up her textbooks and a box of keepsakes before the new semester began. Grace's silver Honda Civic, coated in a thin layer of dust, hummed along Highway 9. Her phone pinged, another reminder from her mom, always worried, always watching the clock. Grace smiled, promising herself she'd call on the way back. She was that kind of daughter. Thoughtful, dependable, never missing a check-in. She slowed at the fork where the blacktop turned to gravel and glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Brown eyes, determined and wide awake. She wondered for just a moment what the day would bring. The air grew thicker as she reached the cabin, dew still fresh on the porch rail. The place looked peaceful, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, crickets singing their last song. Inside, she found familiar chaos. Ethan's boots near the door, a half-read novel on the couch, yesterday's coffee ring staining the counter. She gathered her things quietly, careful not to disturb the calm. But something was off, a tension she couldn't name. She hesitated at the bedroom door, eyes catching on the rumpled sheet and a faint red streak on the white fabric. Her heart beat faster, a cold trickle of anxiety crawling up her spine. Was it just an accident? A nosebleed? She checked her phone. No messages, no missed calls. A tightness grew in her chest. By noon, clouds gathered overhead, darkening the sky. The road back to town seemed longer, quieter. Grace stepped outside, pausing to breathe in the thick, pine-scented air. A single bird called out from the woods, sharp and lonely. She never made that call home. As the sun dipped behind the hills, her phone went silent. Linda Whitmore sat by the window, staring at the driveway, waiting for headlights that never appeared. She dialed Grace's number again and again, hope slowly twisting into dread. That night, rain tapped nervously against the cabin roof. The wind rose, carrying secrets through the trees. When the police arrived hours later, drawn by a mother's pleading call, they found the bed unmade and a thin, unmistakable line of blood on the sheet. Outside, the world felt unchanged. Crickets still chirping, fog drifting over empty roads. But inside that cabin, innocence had vanished. A nightmare was just beginning, and no one in Melbourne would sleep easy again. Melbourne, Arkansas. By late September, the days grew shorter, shadows longer, and the town itself seemed to retreat into old routines. Main Street bustled with familiar faces, Mrs. Rowe sweeping her porch, the church bell tolling noon, the steady clatter of tools at McCall & Son piano repair. To outsiders, Melbourne appeared untouched by tragedy, a postage stamp of Americana. But beneath the gentle surface, stories traveled like wildfire, swift and scorching. Grace Whitmore was the girl everyone noticed, though she never sought attention. At 22, she'd lived in Melbourne her whole life, save for semesters away at the University of Arkansas. People remembered her from high school band, Sunday school, and summers spent teaching kids to read at the library. She was the kind of young woman who wrote thank you notes, who picked wildflowers for her mother, who never left a promise unkept. Her boyfriend, Ethan McCall, was less easy to define. 25, tall and lean, with restless blue eyes and hands calloused from years spent tuning pianos alongside his father. He had grown up wild and bright, a little too clever for his own good, sometimes brooding, often misunderstood. Their relationship had always been a storm, sometimes warm and full of laughter, other times marked by slamming doors and long silences. People whispered, as small towns do, inventing motives and secrets that might not have existed. That weekend, as clouds gathered over the hills, Grace drove her silver Honda to Ethan's cabin one last time. The decision hadn't come easily. She needed her textbooks, a faded photograph, and a worn sweater that still smelled of cedar and rain. She also needed closure, a final goodbye before the next chapter of her life began. Their last argument replayed in her mind as she navigated the winding road, past fields turning gold beneath the waning sun. Inside the cabin, the air hung thick with unresolved tension. Grace moved quietly, gathering her things, trying not to disturb whatever fragile peace remained. Ethan lingered in the background, working on a broken piano leg in the garage, silence stretching between them like a tightrope. The scent of motor oil and sawdust drifted through the open window. By evening, Grace finished packing. She texted a friend, her words simple and reassuring. "Heading home in the morning. Tell my mom not to worry." The message was a promise meant to soothe the ever-present anxiety that gnawed at her mother, Linda. It would also become the last trace anyone had of Grace, a digital echo that would soon haunt every corner of their world. In town, life continued undisturbed. Children played under the oaks, storekeepers swept their steps, and neighbors gathered on front porches to trade gossip. But already a subtle unease had begun to take root, an instinct as old as the hills, warning that something precious was about to be lost. Linda Whitmore, Grace's mother, felt the first tremor of worry that night. She paced the living room, fingers drumming against the arm of her chair, eyes flickering to the clock above the mantel. Grace always checked in, always came home when she said she would. The waiting stretched, every minute heavier than the last. Elsewhere, Ethan sat alone in the quiet cabin, the walls pressing in, regrets whispering through the cracks. Outside, the wind rustled the pines. Somewhere out on Highway 9, a silver Honda was parked in darkness, its secrets locked inside. By dawn, the entire town would know Grace was missing. The ordinary would be shattered, replaced by suspicion, heartbreak, and the relentless search for answers. But in those final hours of September's calm, Melbourne drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that a single text, sent with love and hope, would be the last anyone would ever hear from Grace Whitmore. Monday morning dawned heavy and gray, as if the clouds themselves sensed the unease that now shadowed Melbourne. Grace Whitmore's seat in her first college class sat empty. Her friends at the University of Arkansas wondered if maybe she'd caught a late ride back, maybe slept in after a long drive. Nobody worried, not at first. Grace was responsible. She would show up, always had. But by afternoon, a cold trickle of worry slid down Linda Whitmore's spine. She called Grace's cell. No answer. She sent a message. "Are you home yet, honey?" Silence. The minutes became hours. Linda's voice grew tighter, then desperate as she called again and again, hope crumbling each time her daughter's voicemail clicked on. By evening, she drove the familiar back roads toward Ethan's cabin, her mind racing through every possible explanation except the worst one. The Honda Civic was parked outside Ethan's cabin, untouched, a faint film of dew on the windshield. No sign of struggle, no obvious panic. But the moment Linda stepped inside, a strange chill swept over her. She called out for her daughter. Nothing but her own echo answered. The living room looked ordinary, but in the bedroom, the bed was unmade, the white sheet wrinkled, and a small, dark smear near the edge. Linda's knees nearly buckled. Something was terribly wrong. Officers from Melbourne's small police force arrived quickly. They moved through the cabin quietly, boots scuffing the worn wooden floor, radios crackling in the heavy air. Every detail seemed suspended between the mundane and the sinister. A toothbrush and purse still on the table, Grace's backpack slouched by the door, a faint metallic scent that didn't belong. In the corner, a blanket was missing from the pile by the closet. The window, usually latched, was open a crack. A search began before nightfall. Police scoured the grounds. Volunteers called Grace's name into the thickening dusk. A single, crucial clue emerged. Her phone's signal, last pinged at 2:17 a.m., 8 miles away near Cedar Hollow Bridge, a lonely stretch of road flanked by steep embankments and tangled undergrowth. It was a place local kids avoided after dark, a place that now felt colder than ever. Ethan McCall told officers he'd left early for work that day, claiming Grace was asleep when he walked out the door. His hands shook as he spoke, eyes fixed somewhere just over the officers' shoulders. He repeated the same story, word for word, to everyone who asked. Yet doubts grew, murmured on front porches and whispered over store counters. The McCall family's reputation, solid, hard-working, did little to shield Ethan from suspicion. Half the town wanted to believe him. The other half quietly wondered. That night, as the search widened, the woods echoed with the frantic calls of searchers and the howling of dogs. Flashlights cut through the darkness, tracing paths that led nowhere. Each passing hour pressed heavier on the Whitmore family, each unanswered question multiplying. Had Grace run away? Had something unthinkable happened behind the closed doors of the cabin? No one in Melbourne could sleep. Mothers clung to their children. Doors that once stood open were quietly locked. By sunrise, the investigation had turned up little more than footprints in the dirt and a mother's heartbreak. The town began to fracture under the weight of rumor and uncertainty. Some clung to hope. Others steeled themselves for the worst. In every shadow, people saw a threat. In every silence, a secret. Yet beneath all the noise, the simplest, most painful truth remained. Grace Whitmore was gone. Not a single person had seen her since that silent, uneasy night. All that was left were the marks she left behind. A car, a room, a streak of blood, A final phone signal lost to the darkness near Cedar Hollow Bridge. And somewhere, just beyond reach, the answer to what happened to Grace drifted through the trees, waiting for daylight to bring it into view. News in a small town moves like wildfire, and Melbourne, Arkansas, was no different. By Tuesday morning, every kitchen table, barber shop, and gas station hummed with the story of Grace Whitmore's vanishing. Some people spoke her name in hushed tones, afraid that saying it too loud might make the horror more real. Others offered theories and suspicions, piecing together timelines and motives from scraps of rumor and memory. The search for Grace grew desperate, becoming the center of the town's life. Old-timers, teenagers, off-duty deputies, and neighbors fanned out across fields, woods, and gravel roads. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness, casting thin cones of hope into the tangled brush and along creeks swollen by September rain. Search dogs, noses pressed to the ground, darted ahead while handlers called encouragements into the evening air. Helicopters from Little Rock circled overhead, their blades beating rhythmically as if urging everyone not to give up. For Linda Whitmore, the world became a narrow, suffocating tunnel of worry and dread. She stood by her daughter's toothbrush and purse on the kitchen table, objects that felt at once heartbreakingly familiar and unspeakably distant. Each time a car pulled into the driveway or a phone rang, Linda braced herself, hope and terror tangled in her chest. But the hours stretched on, each more hollow than the last. She found herself staring at the last text her daughter sent, reading and rereading the words. Heading home in the morning. Tell my mom not to worry. The cruel irony stung afresh every time. The police command post buzzed with activity, maps spread wide and radios crackling with updates that always seemed to lead nowhere. The trail appeared to vanish at the back porch of Ethan's cabin, as if Grace had stepped into thin air. The missing blanket, the unmade bed, and that faint, reddish streak on the sheet haunted every detective. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing except a gnawing sense of something terrible lurking just out of sight. A week passed in a haze of false leads, prayers, and sleepless nights. Candlelight vigils grew along the roadside, flickering in the darkness like tiny stars against the gathering gloom. People who'd never met Grace left flowers and notes, hoping their small gestures might somehow ease a family's pain or coax the lost girl home. In this moment, the whole town was a single beating heart, aching, bewildered, and unable to turn away. Then, on September 27th, a hiker wandering a steep embankment off Highway 9 noticed a foul, unmistakable smell drifting through the trees. Drawn by dread, he pushed through the undergrowth, the ground soft beneath his boots. There, wrapped in a dirt-stained blanket, lay the lifeless body of Grace Whitmore. Her long brown hair was tangled with leaves and mud, her arms folded unnaturally at her side. The hiker staggered back, shouting for help, his voice echoing off the pines. In that instant, all hope was extinguished. The fear that had stalked Melbourne for days sharpened into grief, sudden and overwhelming. The news sped through town, delivered by trembling hands and choked voices. People wept openly in the aisles of grocery stores and along the pews of the church. Life as they knew it, safe, predictable, innocent, was gone. That night, hundreds gathered along Highway 9. Candles lined the roadside, their flames trembling in the Arkansas breeze. Some stood in silence, arms around each other. Others prayed softly or shared memories of Grace, remembering her laughter, her kindness, her plans for the future now stolen away. For Melbourne, A chapter had ended not with a whimper, but with the raw wound of tragedy. The only thing left was the search for justice, and the hope, faint but stubborn, that the truth would one day come to light. The town of Melbourne barely had time to mourn before police lights returned, red and blue flickering against the trees where Grace's body was found. The quiet sorrow of her discovery quickly gave way to the sharp, clinical urgency of a homicide investigation. State police arrived from Little Rock, their presence somber and thorough, faces hard set against the grief that still hung in the air. They brought evidence kits, crime scene tape, and questions that felt like accusations, slicing through the gentle rhythms of the mountain town. The autopsy results shattered any lingering hope that Grace's death had been quick or accidental. She had been struck in the head more than once with a heavy, blunt object. Bruising along her neck told another part of the story. Her hyoid bone was broken, clear evidence she'd been strangled. There were no signs of sexual assault, no robbery, nothing stolen except her future. The brutality of it stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Detectives walked a careful line between methodical procedure and the mounting urgency pressed on them by a heartbroken community. They dusted the cabin and garage for prints, combed the floorboards, and questioned everyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. But Grace's last hours remained maddeningly opaque, every lead either dissolving into rumor or circling back to the people she trusted most. One strange detail gnawed at Detective Ray Dalton. In Ethan McCall's garage, among cans of motor oil and old tools, sat a broken piano leg. Its edge was jagged, stained dark with what looked like old blood. They swabbed it, sent it for DNA analysis, and waited. The delay was agony. In a case where every moment mattered, the forensic lab might as well have been on the moon. Meanwhile, suspicion coiled tightly around Ethan. He was questioned for hours, his alibi poked and prodded until even his most benign memories sounded hollow. He insisted, again and again, that he had left for work before dawn while Grace was still asleep. But the public, desperate for answers, found little comfort in words. Rumors spread about their fights, about Ethan's temper, about secrets hidden in the woods. Each conversation, each sideways glance grew sharper, dividing the town into camps, those who believed Ethan was guilty and those who were certain the real killer was still at large. Yet despite the swirling suspicion, hard evidence remained elusive. The blanket Grace had been wrapped in was missing from Ethan's cabin, but no fingerprints, other than hers, were found on it. The broken piano leg, promising as it seemed, yielded only a faint, partial DNA sample, too degraded, the lab said, to make a definitive match. There were no tire tracks at the body site, no witnesses on Highway 9, no sign of a struggle outside the cabin. Every theory that surfaced collapsed under scrutiny, each clue evaporating into the humid Arkansas air. As the investigation stalled, grief curdled into frustration and anger. Linda Whitmore made daily trips to the sheriff's office, clutching Grace's school photo and shaking hands, demanding updates that grew thinner and more apologetic with each passing week. The press, sensing the limits of small-town patience, began to drift away. Headlines faded. Flashlights and search dogs were replaced by the distant drone of cicadas. The Whitmore file joined a dozen others in a locked cabinet. Its cover marked pending, a word that felt colder than any pronouncement of guilt. By winter, the community had settled into a bitter new reality. The question of who killed Grace Whitmore lingered like fog on the mountain, neither burning off nor breaking. Some looked over their shoulders at every noise. Others avoided the topic, as if silence could somehow protect them from what the truth might bring. And always, in the background, the sense that something was missing, something just out of reach. A motive, a confession. A single piece of evidence that could finally set a grieving mother and an entire town free. Time, in a town like Melbourne, has a peculiar way of settling over tragedy. After the frenzy of the investigation faded, the search parties dispersed and the candlelit vigils guttered out in the autumn wind. The Whitmore case slipped quietly into silence. What remained was not closure, but a dull ache that lingered in every corner, an empty seat at the dinner table, a mother's eyes constantly searching the horizon, a father's hands trembling as he mowed the same stretch of lawn Grace used to cross. Linda Whitmore found herself returning again and again to the steep embankment off Highway 9. Sometimes she brought flowers, sometimes just a folded note. She knelt on the pine needles, letting the Arkansas wind tangle her hair, and whispered to the ground, "We'll find the truth, sweetheart." The words were both a promise and a plea, carried away by the breeze to the hills beyond. Locals who drove by learned to recognize her silhouette against the trees, an emblem of the case, a silent witness to unfinished justice. The town, for its part, did what towns do. People stopped talking about Grace, as if saying her name might stir up old pain or draw the attention of something worse. Children who had once lit candles now grew into teenagers, their memories of the search growing faint, blurred by the ordinary struggles of adolescence. Storefronts changed, neighbors moved away, and the details of that September slipped behind the glass of old newspaper clippings and yellowed police files. Yet for Linda and a handful of others, the pain never dulled. Each year, on the anniversary of Grace's disappearance, she left a bouquet at the site and pressed a note beneath a rock. "We remember, we wait." Sheriff's deputies, now used to her ritual, watched from a distance. They too felt the weight of unfinished business, a nagging sense that something vital had slipped through their fingers. Inside the Melbourne police station, the Whitmore file gathered dust in a locked cabinet, its spine faded, its label nearly illegible. Detectives came and went, some poring over the details on sleepless nights, others barely glancing at the old case numbers. For years, the file was a reminder of the limits of justice and the stubborn endurance of grief. It wasn't until 2019, 14 years after Grace's death, that the story flickered back to life. A true crime podcast, Echoes of Grace, landed in the earbuds of listeners across Arkansas and beyond. The host's voice was both soothing and relentless, unspooling every detail, the missing blanket, the broken piano leg, the anonymous call that had never been traced. Interviews with Linda were threaded through each episode, her words halting but unwavering. The podcast caught fire. Soon, strangers from across the country wrote letters, called the sheriff's office, and posted theories online. Some suggested new suspects, others claimed to have seen Grace's spirit in the woods or heard her voice in the wind. The attention for Linda was a strange mix of hope and agony. For the first time in years, the case felt alive again, vibrating with the possibility that someone, somewhere, might know the truth. Then, just 2 weeks after the final episode aired, the phone at the Arkansas State Police headquarters rang late one evening. The call was brief, the voice cautious and unfamiliar. The area code read, Oregon. What the caller said would reignite the embers of a case thought long dead and send shockwaves through the quiet streets of Melbourne once again. The tip from Oregon jolted the cold case awake with the force of a thunderclap. For years, Grace's name had been spoken only in whispers, but now detectives gathered in the evidence room with a sense of anticipation they hadn't felt in over a decade. The caller's message was clear, if not chilling. Ethan wasn't alone that night. It was the kind of revelation that shattered old assumptions and demanded a new look at every detail. Detectives dug into the archives, reopening dusty boxes, unsealing plastic evidence bags. The family cabin, once thought to have given up all its secrets, was re-examined through the lens of suspicion. They questioned Ethan's timeline, searching for cracks in his story. But this new lead pointed not at Ethan himself, but at someone who had always stood just outside the spotlight, his cousin, Dylan Miller. Dylan had stayed at the cabin that weekend. He was a few years older than Grace, and after the tragedy, he'd left Arkansas behind, quietly moving to Oregon within days of the murder. At the time, no one had thought much of it. People left town for new jobs, to chase fresh starts, to escape the ghosts of what they'd seen or done. But now the timing felt ominous. In a stroke of luck or fate, a single long-forgotten sample of DNA had survived in the evidence vault, a trace of sweat found on the edge of the dirt-stained blanket that had shrouded Grace's body. Back in 2005, the technology couldn't do much with it. But in 2020, forensic science was different, faster, sharper, more exact. When the results came back, the match was nearly absolute, 99.8% certainty. The DNA belonged to Dylan Miller. The news broke like wildfire. Dylan was tracked down and arrested in Coos Bay, Oregon, his new life dissolving in the blink of an eye. The interrogation was tense, but the story tumbled out in pieces. We argued. She insulted me. I didn't mean to kill her. He confessed to hitting Grace with the piano leg, panicking as the situation spiraled out of control, then wrapping her in the blanket and dumping her off the highway embankment under cover of night. For a brief, hollow moment, it seemed like closure had finally arrived. But the more investigators pressed, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Dylan's account was patchy, sometimes contradicting the evidence. Phone records showed a 22-minute call between him and Grace that night, much longer than a quick argument. The blood pattern in the garage revealed DNA from two people, not just Grace and Dylan. Someone else had been there. Someone who either witnessed the violence or helped cover it up. Rumors swelled again in Melbourne. Ethan's name crept back into conversations. Some insisted the police had gotten it wrong from the start. Others wondered whether Dylan had been protecting someone, or if fear had kept other secrets locked away for years. The small town, still scarred by the loss, found itself divided once more. Linda Whitmore listened to the news with a heart that couldn't quite grasp relief. She had learned that the truth, once glimpsed, always raised new questions. She clung to the hope that the last missing piece, the second shadow in the cabin that night, would one day step into the light. And so the case that had haunted Melbourne was not truly closed. It had only become more complex, the mystery deepening with every answer that was finally unearthed. The trial of Dylan Miller captured more attention than anything Melbourne had witnessed in years. Reporters came from Little Rock and Memphis, their vans parked by the courthouse, satellite dishes glinting in the autumn sun. Inside, faces from every corner of the town filled the gallery. Neighbors who had watched Grace grow up, classmates who remembered her laughter, strangers who had joined the search years before. The entire community seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something like justice. Dylan Miller, thinner and paler than anyone remembered, stood before the judge and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. His voice was subdued, drained of defiance. The courtroom's silence pressed in as the sentence was read. 40 years in prison, no chance of parole for decades. It was a number both immense and unsatisfying, weighed against the life he had taken, and the years lost to grief. Linda Whitmore rose as the gavel fell. Her hands were steady, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke, not to the court, but to the man who had confessed to ending her daughter's life. I forgive you, but someone else knows what you're hiding. The words lingered, heavy and unresolved, echoing off the polished wood and marble. Outside, the press swarmed, hungry for statements, but Linda offered none. She walked home alone, past shuttered stores and faded posters calling for justice. The world seemed unchanged, yet in every shadow, every closed window, she sensed the weight of secrets still unspoken. For all the headlines and news flashes, the core of the story remained locked in silence, a puzzle with a missing piece. Within the case files, one clue still stood out: the second DNA trace found on the blanket and the record of a 2:17 a.m. phone call from an unlisted number. It had never been identified, never explained. The investigators pressed on for a time, chasing new leads and dead ends, but eventually the fervor faded, leaving the case both closed and unsatisfying. Justice had come, but only in part. The absence of a full answer gnawed at everyone touched by the tragedy. In the months after the trial, the town of Melbourne seemed to breathe a little easier, but trust was slower to return. Old friends found it hard to meet each other's eyes at church or in line at the store. The familiar feeling of safety, once so natural it went unnoticed, never fully recovered. Parents clutched their children tighter, teens came home before dark, and rumors about that night flared and faded with each changing season. Linda visited Grace's grave often, sometimes leaving wildflowers, sometimes just sitting in the grass and listening to the wind. She spoke quietly, not always seeking answers, but needing to remember, needing to believe that the truth would one day find its way into the open. In her heart, she clung to the hope that forgiveness was possible, even when certainty was not. The town, too, learned to live with ambiguity. Life moved forward, stores reopened, new families moved in, children grew up with only whispered stories about the tragedy that had once gripped their home. But on certain nights, when the wind moved through the pine trees in a certain way, it seemed as if the whole valley paused, remembering the girl whose smile once lit up its streets. Grace Whitmore's case had changed Melbourne forever. Even after the gavel's echo faded and the headlines vanished, the silence that followed was never truly empty. It held the questions left behind, the grief that lingered, and the possibility that someday the final secret would rise to the surface. Behind every headline, every grim statistic, and every tragic anniversary, there is a story that belongs to a real person. In Melbourne, Arkansas, the name Grace Whitmore became a touchstone for loss and caution, a tale passed down in whispers and sideways glances. But what lingered most, even after a conviction, was the sense that some mysteries resist closure, that the truth, when it comes, never fully explains or soothes the pain left behind. The story of Grace Whitmore, while dramatic and haunting in its own right, was a reflection of something that had truly happened. In another September, another small town in Arkansas, a young woman named Rebekah Gould vanished under circumstances that echoed through families and generations. Rebekah, like Grace was a daughter, a friend, a student with a future so vivid It felt almost guaranteed. She too had left home for college, returned to visit, and then disappeared without warning, her presence slipping from the world with barely a trace. The search for Rebekah had mobilized her entire community. For weeks, hope flickered across the hills and hollows as neighbors scoured creek beds and woodland trails, their hands shaking as they parted branches, their voices hoarse from calling her name. Prayers drifted upward from porches and churches, and mothers gripped their daughters a little tighter. It was as if, for a moment, time itself had stopped, holding its breath as the community confronted the reality that evil could visit even the safest places. 16 years passed before the man responsible was arrested. William Alma Miller, an acquaintance, not a stranger, as is so often the case, was found living far away in Oregon. The years between the crime and the confession were filled with questions, with grief that settled deep into the bones of those left behind. When Miller finally admitted what he had done, relief mingled with disbelief. Justice, in the end, was complicated. Some wounds never fully healed, no matter how many years or answers were offered. In retelling the story through the lens of Grace Whitmore's fictional tragedy, the goal was never to exploit pain or sensationalize loss, but to honor the weight of what happened. Every detail, from the missing blanket to the unanswered call in the middle of the night, was drawn from a reality that left scars on those who lived through it. The intent was to invite empathy, to remind anyone listening that behind the headlines are lives interrupted, families who wait, who remember, who hope for truth even when justice feels partial or incomplete. Melbourne and towns like it across the country carry these stories quietly. They shape the way doors are locked at night, the way strangers are regarded, the way a parent's heart jumps when the phone rings late. Sometimes they lead to change, new laws, renewed vigilance, stronger communities. Other times, they simply linger, unanswered and unsatisfying, shaping the rhythm of ordinary life for those who remain. But the legacy of these tragedies is more than loss. It is also resilience, the refusal to let a name be forgotten, the insistence on telling the story until every last piece of truth is uncovered. In sharing Grace's story, the memory of Rebekah Gould and others like her endures, not only as a warning, but as a call to compassion and courage. Because for every cold case that gathers dust, there are families who never give up hope, and a world that needs reminding. Some stories demand to be told, again and again, until all the voices that were silenced are finally heard. Long after the cameras had vanished, after the verdicts and newsprint had faded, Grace Whitmore's memory remained woven into the fabric of Melbourne, Arkansas. Her story lingered in the spaces between daily life, a name spoken in reverence, a face remembered at church suppers, a presence felt in the hush that sometimes fell over the town's old back roads. For Linda Whitmore, there was never such a thing as moving on. Her life now unfolded in 2 chapters, before and after Grace. Each day, she carried the weight of her daughter's absence, the empty room still dusted and sunlit, the unanswered texts saved on a fading phone, the birthday cake each September that sat untouched except for the single candle. Linda's grief had matured into a quiet strength. She became a voice for those still searching, organizing support groups for families living with the silence of unsolved cases, reminding them that justice, however long delayed, was always worth seeking. The townspeople, too, carried their own versions of remembrance. High school teachers told new students about Grace's kindness and dedication. Neighbors recalled the summer afternoons she spent reading to children at the library, her laughter echoing long after she was gone. Sometimes, at dusk, candles were left along Highway 9, a soft, flickering trail leading toward the embankment where she had last been found. These gestures became rituals, small beacons that kept hope alive and reminded everyone that loss need not be hidden away. But if there was a lesson in Grace's story, it was not just about grief. It was about vigilance, empathy, and courage. It was about the moments when someone's instincts told them that something wasn't right, and the importance of listening to that inner warning. Grace's tragedy taught Melbourne to pay attention, to reach out to friends who seemed troubled, to report the small things that felt off, to speak up for those whose voices had been taken. Justice is not always swift or perfect. The case had been closed, reopened, and left incomplete, like so many others. Yet the community discovered that the act of remembering, of telling the story, was its own kind of justice, a way to honor the person lost and to protect those who remained. Candlelight vigils, social media posts, community meetings, and true crime podcasts all played their part in keeping the flame alive. Linda's message, repeated often, but always with quiet conviction, was simple. Some wounds can only be healed by the truth. She urged others never to settle for easy answers, never to let fear or fatigue silence their search for what really happened. For her, for Grace, for the families of Rebekah Gould and countless others, remembrance was not just an act of love, but a refusal to let the darkness have the last word. So the call went out, as steady and persistent as the Arkansas wind. If you believe every story deserves to be told, do not turn away. Subscribe, turn on notifications, share the memory, and help keep these stories alive so that justice never sleeps and hope, however fragile, can always find its way home. In the quiet that followed, Melbourne learned to live with its scars. Yet beneath the sorrow, there remained a powerful undercurrent of resilience, a promise that as long as even one person remembered Grace Whitmore, the light she brought to the world could never truly be extinguished. And in that promise, the town found its strength, ready to face another day, never forgetting, always hoping, and always telling the stories that needed to be heard.